Welcome back. It's one of the oldest conspiracy theories in the book, that Shakespeare didn't write Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth and all the rest. And a new film, Anonymous, is now among those who come to bury Shakespeare, not to praise him. It credits the Earl of Oxford, an Elizabethan courtier, with being the real bard. The film, which premieres tonight, has sparked protests in Stratford-upon-Avon and outrage in the academic community, as our culture editor Matthew Cain reports.
So you are the famous William Shakespeare, whose labours I have so enjoyed.
He's our best-loved playwright and wrote some of the most famous phrases in the English language. Or did he? According to new film Anonymous, William Shakespeare might not have been the author of his work after all.
Yes, I'm addressing the writer of Hamlet, and of Juliet and her Romeo, am I not?
The film suggests Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, as the most likely author.
All art is political, Johnson, otherwise it would just be decoration.
The author of these works would have to have been well-travelled, would have to have been a multilinguist, and would have to have had a really deep knowledge of the inner workings and mechanisms of a very secretive and paranoid Elizabethan court. All these boxes are ticked by Edward de Vere.
This isn't the first time that Shakespeare's authorship has been called into question. Over the years, Sir Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe and Sir Walter Raleigh have all been credited with being the real author of his plays. Doubts centre around the fact that William Shakespeare was from a working-class background and only had a basic education. But most Shakespeare experts reject these conspiracy theories, and in protest against the film, today some of them have obliterated all mention of Stratford's most lucrative exports from the town.
It's very irritating to see Shakespeare, the greatest writer of all time, portrayed as a drunken, illiterate buffoon, and all the credit for his works given to the Earl of Oxford, who died 7 years before the last of the plays came out. It's partly because of snobbery in a lot of cases. They would like to feel that the author of these great works must have been an aristocrat.
Historical fiction in general is currently going through a boom period, from the novels of Philippa Gregory to TV dramas like The Borgias. But although many examples of the genre take real characters and situations as their starting point, the constraints of form and the need to tell a good story can often impinge on historical accuracy. And some academics believe this is an irresponsible approach to historical truth.
The fact that they have a little disclaimer saying based on a true story gives people an encouragement to believe that everything that they're seeing is true. And this is, I think, deeply worrying. We're living in an age where, there is a tremendous historical ignorance, which of course is a danger, but also that is combined with this inability really to decipher, to recognise the differences between fact and fantasy.
Is it irresponsible to put forward this theory, knowing that people are going to go away thinking that it's true?
I think it's irresponsible, actually, to kind of tell people, you know, knowing that all these doubts exist, to kind of tell them, you know, the man from Stratford wrote it. That's, I think, it's irresponsible.
Irresponsible or not, perhaps Shakespeare himself might not have been too offended by the film. As a playwright used to reworking history, he might even have understood the filmmaker's decisions. Although his true reaction, like his identity, would of course be impossible to prove.
Matt Cain, well, with me now, the leading Shakespeare scholar, Professor Michael Dobson, who's a trustee of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, for whom it would be a bit of a disaster if there was any truth in this.
Well, it would be a wonderful thing for my career if there were any evidence and I discovered it, but sadly there isn't any. There's lots of evidence that Shakespeare wrote his own plays, and there's lots of evidence that the Earl of Oxford was dead before he'd finished doing it.
I mean, well, it's a bit strange that you're still having this argument, isn't it?
It's a bit strange that it ever started, and I hate to sound like Liam Fox, but the media are in part to blame. It's one of those viral stories that gets going in the mid-Victorian period, and the story Shakespeare didn't write his own plays is just more interesting to journalists than the truth Shakespeare did.
Really. I mean, I suppose, are you worried, as we heard in the film, you know, that the impact of these sorts of movies is that people come out of the movie theatre and think, oh, that was true?
I think you'd have to be pretty literal-minded and work pretty hard to believe that this film was true when you'd seen it. Just as I don't think very many people came out of Shakespeare in Love really thinking that Shakespeare had written Romeo and Juliet because he fancied Gwyneth Paltrow when she was dressed as a boy. I think what's more worrying is that Sony Pictures are trying to sell the film by saying it's really educational and it's full of the truth and you need to see it. I think that's irresponsible and unethical.
But what about this sort of... I don't know whether it's popular myth or whether it's true about, you know, the children, you know, that the daughters were illiterate, the son never mentioned it in his diaries. I mean,
the son.
Is there any truth in any of this stuff?
Well, the son died when he was 9 and didn't keep any diaries. The daughters signed their names with a mark in some legal documents, but then a lot of graffiti artists tag instead of signing their full names. It doesn't mean they're illiterate. You know, there's lots and lots of evidence that Shakespeare was Shakespeare and was a highly accomplished writer.
I mean, do you think it's basically snobbery, that people don't like the idea that somebody like Shakespeare from his background could have written this amazing canon of work?
That's part of it, and unfortunately in our times, you know, the view that you have to have had a very expensive education to do anything worthwhile looks more like the status quo than a radical alternative position. I think it's also in part that it's a much more exciting daydream fantasy, being an unacknowledged genius who's secretly the rightful heir to the throne. I mean, that's got a kind of emotional appeal that just being a really successful, really talented show business person from the Midlands is never going to have.
Well, you seem pretty relaxed about it, Professor. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Something strange about a German film director questioning whether Shakespeare was actually writing these plays when he, in fact, admitted he didn't like reading them when he was at school. Anyway, just a thought.
You're comfortable saying that because you're German?
Yeah. That's not Anyway.